Hi everyone, thanks for joining. This is Ciaran from hrsafe, and with me today is Antony Malmo from Allos Australia. Antony is a director there, and we're going to talk a little bit about what Allos does, what they do with us, and what they do with their own businesses, and of course a couple of terrific guides Antony has released this week. So Antony, again, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and again the size and complexity of the industries you work with, and of course Allos itself.
For sure, mate. Well, thanks for having me on. Hi to everyone who's watching either now and or in the future. So, in terms of the kind of businesses we're operating with, it's a real range. We have businesses as small as an orthodontics studio with just 26 people, all the way up to a national agribusiness company with they're about 750 staff. So that's kind of the range. I think in terms of and you asked in terms of like what industries. That's a really interesting one. In the early days when we came out, we're like, we're going to revolutionize this industry. We can help everybody. Everybody's going to love us. And actually, what you realize is that there's not all businesses are ready for this. They're not at that level of maturity, or they're not. I think they're still stuck in that compliance stage around mental health, and they're not thinking in terms of. They haven't yet come to the realization of the profitability of it for an organization, but then also what it can mean in terms of being a competitive advantage, right? So that's the kind of level. So interestingly, we work across everything from government, like local governments. We have high tech companies. We've got, as I said, agribusiness. We've got small pharmaceutical and companies like that. So it's a real mixed bag. And so we've often said, okay, so what are the industries that we work in? And we've kind of figured it out. There's kind of three things. Number one, it's companies that if things go wrong, they're expensive and they're potentially lethal, right? So they cannot afford to be reactive, right? And our whole thing is be proactive, anticipate these things and get out on the front foot. And so, you've got companies who are working in very high risk industries and can't afford for things to go wrong. So then they need someone like us on board who are really on the front foot. Then you've got other organizations who they're already doing a heap of awesome things for their staff, right? They've got all the good well-being strategies in place, and they're really after the best talent. So these are often in your more tech space, is what we've noticed as well.
Right.
But then there's kind of a missing in their suite. There's one missing thing, and that's kind of the EAP, where it tends to sit in the background kind of reactively, and it's just a number on the phone on the wall that people call. And so our whole approach helps and say, okay, well, if you want something up at the same caliber as everything else you're doing that kind of matches what you're doing, that's where we've found a real match with people. And here's the other thing you might be interested in, because I know you've got an opinion about getting like CHROs on board, right? Here's the one thing that came out for us is that when we looked across the board in all of them, HR have a real seat at the table, right? And you've got really competent people in HR who are doing great stuff, and most importantly, the C-suite. They're either on the C-suite or they're taken very seriously by the C-suite. So, and I guess that's kind of a reflection of company values to a degree, right? Like, what matters? Do people really matter to your organization? And so what we notice is in the organizations that do, they're the kind of ones that are prepared to go, all right, your Allos is the kind of company we want on board.
Yeah. And what's exactly the composition of Allos? So I think you mentioned to me offline, you've got about 30 psychologists, and they provide a...
Yeah. So, well, look, so we hire psychologists and counselors, but we don't even limit to that. So this is a really interesting thing. Like for us, it's a real re-education to people around what does EAP mean, right? So we're looking at it and saying, so we will deal with the crisis end of it, the pointy end of mental health, right, for people. But at the same time, we don't want people waiting until they're in crisis. It's such a waste of time, resources, and people's lives. And If you can do things preventatively and anticipate things and get and encourage people to get on early and get out there and get them using services early, then that opens up a whole range of ways that you can help people therapeutically way earlier on, right? So I've got a guy on board who specializes in mindfulness and movement, right? Now, that's because if you think about, you've got the clinical end of it and the sharp end. Well, even before that, all of us are we're all on this spectrum somewhere, right? Moving up and down. And if you can get people where they don't have a clinical illness, but they're kind of worried. They're well, but they're worried, right? They're worried well. And they're feeling stressed out about things. Well, if you can provide something to somebody at that point in their life, where they're at, that helps them get back on track, it's way cheaper, way faster, and way more effective.
Yeah,
And
now that's a really good point and a question I've been dying to ask after reading the two guides. And I'm asking this question on behalf of a big question I get from every prospective business owner that I pitch to, and I guess what people just do in general. And I find there's generally two types of business owners when you look at things from a non-financial perspective, whether it's HR in general or safety in general, or of course the wider expanded people orientated fields, including yours, which is generally you get the one business owner that is the one that you've just described earlier, and they're your ideal ones that generally see a lot of value in their employees, want to help them, they're go-getters, they have a crow at the seat of the table, and the list goes on. But what you can see is generally an employer that has a very strong people focus. And then you have the other employer, which unfortunately I'd have to say is the majority that I still see. And they're the ones that I'm usually up against in arbitration, mediation, dispute resolution, and so on. And they're the ones that really do not care about the employee. They don't have any of that framework or structure. And I actually wrote something on LinkedIn, if people want to look at it, on our webpage, which said how to spot a good employer from a bad one. And it's based on observations that I've had from a strategic as well as line or operational business perspective. And the first thing you do is open up an ASX listed report of a big company. And if they don't even mention safety, fair work, mental health at all in there, and some of these reports are 500 pages, it's a great way of showing they don't care about their people. Now, to both, and probably even more so the latter, the first thing that, and I think the ideal one that does care about their employee probably won't worry about this too much, but certainly the latter will say, can you describe to me a financial benefit and how you would measure that potentially on the balance sheet for an EAP, so access to employee assistance program. And if, for instance, and I'll use a financial example for us when we're pitching, is we might pitch to a winery that's got 35 employees. It would be $10 per person per month for that access. So they would then put that back to me and say, well, how do I sell this to a director who, between the lines, sees people as numbers on a balance sheet only? So how would you answer and describe that?
Hey, that's a big one. And you know what? I reckon 20 years ago, that would have been tough to argue. I think 10 years ago, it started getting better. And I think more recently, there's numbers out there that really start showing it. So to put that in perspective, first we have to step back and go, well, what are we doing here? Well, at its core, you're preventing losses. You're preventing things, preventing costs from occurring inside of an organization. And in that, there are quite tangible, discrete costs that you can see and you can measure. And then there are those that are harder to measure. So to give you an idea, here are the ones that are easy to measure. Absenteeism, right? Staff attrition, right? Or staff turnover, where people are leaving the organization. Those are the easy ones. The other ones, though, are the things that people don't see, and they're bigger. And the numbers on this are actually very clear. Things like presenteeism. So you're turning up at work. You turn up in body, but not in mind. You're not switched on. You're distracted. And this year has been the example for that, right? Like, how many of us have just had COVID brain, right? Like and it's all of this. Like, but even before this, it's look, what, half of all relationships and marriages end in divorce. I mean, that's a perfect example of the kind of thing. You're trying to do your job at work. You're trying to look at that Excel spreadsheet and get those numbers in. But really, you've been just on the phone constantly all morning as relationship breaks apart, or lawyers or what have you. You're mentally not there. That presenteeism cost, that's about 3 to 4 times higher than your absenteeism costs, right? So these are the secret things that you need to tap in. Now, the interesting thing is when you make that case to an organization, they say, well, prove the cost. You actually need a bit of a before and after shot. Most organizations aren't measuring this, especially if you've only got 35 people, you don't have the resources, you're not measuring that.
Yeah, the latter employer that I described usually doesn't have a crow, so a HR capability, so they don't measure any of these at all.
Yeah. But I think the starting point for this is to actually raise this to people's awareness. Where are all the drains that are coming from it? There's another thing here too, right? So there's that common statistic that's bandied about, like 1 in 5 people at any one point in time have a mental health condition, right? So they've they were well, stuff's gone on in life and they've slipped, right? Life gets messy, life gets hard. And they've slipped down into this point where they're in a very low state and they're struggling. And what happens is that you've got to ask yourself, well, if you look at your if you were to look at how many people, let's say a work cover claim, right? How many of the people who are going to make a work cover claim for a mental health claim or such come from that percentage of those people who are affected? And you start to realize, well, pretty much all of likely scenario, most, if not all, are going to be in that state. So then you're like, okay, well, how much does that cost? And I've seen the numbers that they've, I think it was WorkSafe throughout it's around the $24,000 mark or thereabouts. I checked that a year or two ago. Seems to be around $24,000 for the average mental health claim, right? But of course, the variety is huge. Like, so, it goes all the way out to 200,000, 300,000. So these are all these risks. And I think there's other numbers out there as well. So this is another one that we had to dig into and kind of look into. So if you add up I'm blending blue collar, white collar here. I hate that delineation, but that's what was in the study. You look at lost productivity for somebody experiencing moderate depression. It's going to be costing a company around $13,000 a year. So the question is, if you want to stop that, then you've got to prevent. The best course of action is to get in there early and stop that from happening in the first place. And so the thing is, though, and this is kind of the essence of what our whole business model's on, Ciaran, is that if you're waiting until people are in that state, you're kind of after the fact. The losses have already taken place inside the organization. And so the game here is in prevention. So there's that. But you know what? There's another part here, and that's simply anecdotal evidence with people, like that people can relate to. Because when you say the word mental health, people they get all clinical and they kind of get it's off-putting for a lot of people. But when you start talking about relatable stories, like we've got one, I had a HR person say to us about 2 years ago. She goes, "Look, really interesting. I've had 3 people come up to me this quarter saying that if we hadn't been there, they would have quit."
Yeah.
And I said to her, okay, what's that worth to you? She goes, well, about 3 months salary per person. I'm like, right, so what are we talking? Something like, what, 90K, something like that? Or like, what, 60, 80, 90K? She goes, yeah, about that. She goes, and I'm like, yeah, we clearly, I did the ROI on that. I'm like, just from that one story, our ROI was 10 to 1 on that one event. We're not even talking about all the other stuff. And then we know from within the kind of conversations that we have that we're stopping work cover claims happening. But yeah, and they're all the big bright ones. But I think that it's actually about the 1%ers. I think that's where the value proposition is for a lot of people. Like going to work and being stressed out and dealing with people problems all day long. And like I talk to managers, what do they talk about all the time? It's like people problems. You can help there a lot and smooth things over.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So would it be fair? It would be a fair statement to say there's empirical evidence that shows there is a reduction in absenteeism, in addition to presenteeism, presenteeism is a bit more abstract to measure, but it is measurable because you can measure it via engagement. So there's already balance sheet there, and then of course you're obviously seeing reductions in turnover. And for those that aren't aware, there's a lot of very recent studies that are updated yearly, included one by the Australian Institute of Management, that the average turnover cost Australia, so this is across all industries after all the stats and all the surveys updated yearly, is around about $25,000 per person, and that is exclusive of recruitment costs. and then you add on a 6 month between a three, depends on the level, the skill level, but there's a 3 and 6 month lagging indicator of getting that person up to speed after you've recruited them. Right now, under the IFRS statements, they don't measure that Australia, but there is human capital standards in Europe that does measure that. So there is ways you can measure that on the balance sheet. It is significant.
Yeah, look, and here's the other thing. We do pre and post tests for people. It's all voluntary, of course, for ethical reasons, and we don't want anyone not seeking support if they don't want to fill out a form. But sometimes people will fill out that form, and it has like 5 simple questions on it. It's like, how many hours, for what you're coming to see us about right now, how many hours have you had off, do you reckon, in the last month? How many days have you had off? And to measure that present, how many hours you've been at work, but you haven't really you've been distracted and dealing with this other issue. And then, your work-life satisfaction. So how satisfied are you at work, and how are you thinking about? And what we find is that, and then we follow up with them 90 days later and get those numbers. And what you typically see is it's about 25% reduction in in presenteeism, about 40 in absenteeism. I'll double check that, but
that's significant.
Well, it is. It's a small sample size, mate. That's the thing, right? But it's all of this is indicative that all of it is adding up to. It's echoing what the big proper research says as well, which is get in early, stop it. It's just, I think it's, as I said before, people have to. I don't think people are nearly aware enough about just how much money their businesses are hemorrhaging through lost productivity.
And I think the key to that, to translate that into a HR strategy, based off what you're saying, is you're reducing your unplanned leave and hopefully maintaining or appropriately scheduling your planned leave. That would be the end goal, in addition to increasing engagement. Okay, cool. Now, I just want to move on to your 2 guides. So you released these this week. One's called the Employee's Guide to Successfully Returning to the Office. So obviously this is aimed at the post-COVID world that we live in. And the second guide is the Employer's Guide to Successfully Getting Workers Back into the Office. So obviously you saw something from, on a fairly large scale in relation to COVID-19 and working from home that you felt you needed to release this guide. So can you tell us fairly shortly and succinctly what you saw this year that led you to developing these 2 guides?
So after having conversations since COVID started, with people every week, checking in with employees and leaders and the whole works, and we've had, I think I've literally not just me, the whole team, we've spoken with thousands now. And what was coming out more recently, even back in October when it was announced going back to the office, a lot of people kind of confiding, like, I don't want to go back. No, I don't. Like, this is good. I'm happy now. And we're like, okay, that's interesting. And then from there, it started to emerge. My whole thing is change management. So I'm looking at it as a change management exercise, saying, well, suddenly what's on the cards is people have become habituated to a new norm. And now they've been given, in a lot of cases, extra freedoms or more control over their life, let's say, by working from home. Even though they have to work longer hours and it's not perfect, and the dog next door barks and all of this kind of stuff, it's their way, their control, plus less scrutiny, right? And then suddenly we're being asked to go back into the office, and especially down here in Melbourne, it was sort of, I think it was a pledge made between the council, Melbourne Council, and some of the biggest employers to get, I think it was something like 30% of their employees back, and now I think it's getting close to 50 of their employees back by a specific date. So it's just this rush back in. And it's a lot. Like, people have been through, you need to understand human psychology and change. People are frayed. They're exhausted this year. I think companies, and I'd probably boil it down to this, companies need to anticipate that this is going to have an impact, right? Some people are going to love it. But even from our own surveys, and I just saw big research out of the US as well, which we were both at the 70% mark. 70% of people have anxieties or reservations about heading back into the workplace as it is, or going back to how things were. They're not, 70% of people aren't interested in that. They want to keep doing, or they want to do something else. And if you keep pushing people down that road without doing proper change management and really engaging with people, that's a recipe for disaster. So the psychological injury risks are on the table with people. So I'm saying anticipate that.
Right. So if employers fail to return workers and also manage their own risks returning en masse back to the workplace, they're at a high risk of injury right now. That's what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, yeah, higher, let's say.
Higher, yeah.
You're in this space more than myself, mate. Like, this is like when COVID all hit and we all had to change and we all had to do something in an emergency, got it. There was no real warning. This time around, though, we do know, right? This is planned. I know it's hurried, but it is planned to a degree. So
Yeah.
I don't know if organisations can really claim ignorance of the fact that this wasn't going to be an issue. Like, you couldn't see this coming. And so if you know there's a risk, I think there's a level of duty. But maybe you could speak to that. I mean, what are the responsibilities for organisations if you know there's a risk? And what does that mean heading back into the office?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You've got a fiduciary responsibilities that's short of it, illegal and ethical, under both acts, both the Fair Work and Work Health and Safety Act. The Fair Work Act is the more one to worry about when it comes to bullying because it has enforceable consequences. The Work Health and Safety Act, unfortunately, generally doesn't. When it comes to the bullying side of it, however, physical is quite different.
Yep.
And I think one of the longer term implications I think we're going to see out of this is both the poor response by employers to move workforces en masse to home and back. And when I say long term, it's because I don't know how many employers I've spoken to, and I probably say 100% of everyone that I've spoken to that works in an office environment said, well, we just let people grab stuff and take it home. And I said, well, where was your ergonomic assessment? And people forget that if you work at a desk, your two biggest risks in your entire life working at a desk is carpal tunnel, in addition to sedientary, which leads to heart disease. And I'm seeing the same thing. Everyone's returning back to their workplace and haven't had a proper ergonomic assessment by a qualified ergonomist whose qualifications and certifications are through the roof, that they actually fall under the medical profession. Okay, so forgetting about safety and HR. And I'm already talking to people saying I'm already having problems with my arms and everything else. And I'm like, these are cheap. They're in a lot of EBA. So if you're in defence, for instance, it's free. It doesn't even cost your unit money. And I don't know how many defence people I've spoken to. They're like, oh, we're not worrying about it. I'm like, well, fine. How's your employer going to feel if in 5 and 10 years' time you are exiting the workforce 10 years earlier than you should be with a permanent injury? We're just about out of time, mate. So I just want to talk just quickly about the two guides. What if you're an employer or an employee? Why should you look at your two guides? What do they cover?
So in terms of this really looks at how you manage change. How are you going to get your people, if you are going to take your people back in the office, by the way, how are you going to do it in a way that protects people's mental health to the best of it can be done. And the real thing we looked at here was, well, how do you make this look successful? We wanted to get rid of all the clinical jargon, get rid of all of that, just make it straight, simple, and practical for people, and cover off on what we know is going through employers' minds, what we know is going through employees' minds, and then say, okay, well then we've got competing needs here. How are you going to navigate this together intelligently to get the best outcome for everyone in going forwards? So, because there's no map here, mate. There are no experts going forwards on this. It's going to require, like, it's a wickedly complex problem.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's going to require communication with people, and it's going to require collaboration. Don't just think that if you physically moving people is enough. We need to get our heads right about this. And if people feel left out in the cold on their opinions and don't have any say in how this goes on, that's going to lead to resentment. People will walk and they're going to go find other places to work. Yep. I think that's the other big risk here.
If I'm an employer or an employee, what's the best way for me to get a copy of this guide from you?
Right. Look, I put them up on LinkedIn, and that was just to test the waters and see what the response was like. It's been huge. Like, I woke up this morning and they've clearly hit a mark with people. So at the moment, that's where they're at. But I think going forwards, what we might do is I might even pass on some copies to you. And if people want, let's send them out, because clearly, yeah, I'm taken aback by just how much this has resonated with people, to be honest.
Okay, if I'm not on LinkedIn, is there an email or somewhere I can send something to?
Yeah, look, send it through to hello@allos, ALLOS.com.au.
Okay, I'll put that email in the link to this YouTube.
Yeah, for sure. Send it through, and we can start a conversation. Send it through, and if people need more help and a few ideas and tips and tricks on this, well, then we're more than happy to have a chat and walk them through it as well.
Well, terrific. All right, Anthony. Thank you very much for your time, and no doubt we'll have another podcast in the future on something wonderful. Thanks for listening.
No
guys.
worries, Ciaran. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Have a good Christmas.
You too. See ya.
Bye.